So I will be showing some slides with some photos from the field. So waiting for the slides to start, but yeah, I can maybe say that I started studying resource extraction in 2004 and studied industrial forestry and tree plantation expansion and conflicts, especially in Brazil and rest of South America since 2004. And after that, in 2010, I continued by focusing attention on the mining industry in Brazil, India, and Finland. So maybe the next slide. Yeah, so here are some key points that should be considered when designing studies on resistance to extractivisms. And these points flow from my empirical exposures, plus the social movement literature, the most recent developments, especially in the branch of social movement studies, which is called the study of social movement outcomes, the dynamics of contention tradition by Tarot, Tilley, and McAdam, and many other theories. So one thing that should be considered is that you should take into notion the impact of the particular sector and the subsector. For example, in mining or forestry, you cannot assume that these would have the same kind of conflict parameters or extractivist expansion parameters or resource exploitation parameters. So you cannot also assume that the resistance would be similar. You see a lot of studies out there which make, for example, large-scale quantitative analysis across hundreds of thousands of cases, which do not control for the impact of the sector. But even in the literature on mining and mining conflicts, you see that, for example, gold has quite different dynamics in comparison to iron ore, for example, or bauxite, or some other minerals. Minerals, then diamonds, metals, they have different kind of dynamics. And then you should also consider, and if it's open pit mining, what kind of open pit mining, large scale, small scale, if it's underground mining. I would even say that you would need different literatures for the study of resistance to open pit mining and underground mining. For example, in iron ore, if you compare the operations of, for example, in northern Sweden, where most of the mining is underground, in iron ore sector, you see completely different dynamics than in the open pit sector, which I have been studying in Brazil and India, where most of the iron ore extraction is actually open pit and causes thus a major impact on forests by removing the vegetation, which the industry calls an overburden, in a kind of sign of the what I would see an extractivist ideology or logic behind the extraction. And then I think it's necessary to also observe the scale. If it's small scale, corporate, large scale, who are the actors mining behind, what is the role of the capital, what kind of minerals, what are the expansion methods. So when I studied these politics, investment politics around iron ore extraction and expansion of that extraction since 2010, I was interested in not only studying if the resistance manages to discontinue whole projects so that those don't continue, but also interested in if they actually manage to change the method. Because in some cases, the resistance does not even look for the closure of all the mining operations, or does not look for the cancellation of the project. So you have to also identify what are the resistance goals. And by resistance here, I mean local resistance. Mostly it can also be resistance from other locales, but the focus is on at the point of extraction. So that constitutes the case across which then I have made comparisons, systematic, qualitative, comparative analysis across those different cases, taking into consideration also the kind of incorporated comparison impacts. So that if you have had a prior conflict elsewhere or prior investment elsewhere, and the mine has been closed, for example, in India, as happened in one case in Kudemuk in 2004, then that impacted the Brazilian setting in the way that later, a few years later, a mine was opened in Minas Gerais state, Conceição de Mato Dentro, which then started to supply the iron ore for the steel mill in India, which couldn't use anymore the Indian iron ore, because and that's why we are talking about global extractivisms. These normally have global impacts and global settings where we are studying these. But for the purposes of comparing the resistant methods, I see resistance as a thing focused on a particular investment project. So in the book Iron Will, I propose a new theory of investment politics, where you study and compare those kind of different investment politics and what has to be taken into consideration in those studies if you want to do a rigorous, methodologically rigorous study. So for industrial forestry, then you should also distinguish between tree plantations types, if it's like corporate, smallholder, state-owned or whatever. So there are also differences in that. Depending on the sector you are studying, I would really encourage you to make those distinctions, because then if you control for the impact of the particular sector, you can be much more sure to control for how that would impact the possible resistance. And this comes from the social movement studies, where they have found that the issue and the type of target is really important in explaining what kind of resistance surges, how does it operate, what are the dynamics, and what might be the outcomes. Because if you study the outcomes, you need to also, or the impacts, you need to study not only the resistance, but also other kind of things. And with resistance, I don't mean only organized mass social movements, but they can be also NGOs of different types. They can be also trade unions, or they can be networks of different movements together, or they can be altogether different kind of organizations. They can be, for example, armed guerrilla groups. They can be armed secessionist groups, like in northeastern India, where the goal of that kind of armed resource conflict or armed resource resistance is not so much to overthrow the state and impose a new Marxist or Maoist state as in the Naxalite movement in India, but rather to gain more of an independent state. So there are different kind of armed resistance also. But altogether, I think that resistance as a concept captures this variety of things better than the earlier conceptualizations that focused merely on social movements, quite bluntly in some cases. So besides this, there's a need to also control for the role of the political system and other contextual variants. So I would encourage in the early stage to focus only on the same polity and context, because it gets really complicated when you have two different contexts, especially if they are very varying, and start from building up from a case study in one place and then broadening it. If you have a comparison of different contexts, like I had Brazil and India, then you have to ensure that there's enough of similarity, but also of difference. In the case of Brazil and India, they were both consolidating democracies during the studied period between 2005 and 2015. After that, they have taken both a turn to authoritarianism. So a new study on that kind of contextual feature would be possible now. Then you have contextual variance between the cases I studied. For example, in India, you have large areas which are under armed conflicts and so on. And yes, you need to consider also the role of the government, state actors, and so on, to which I will come back later. But before starting to talk more in detail about those cases and resistance, I would maybe take a look at what is the global setting of extractivism. What does that entail currently? So there's a need to situate, I think, the studies on resistance also into the broader setting. Next slides, please. So here you see the so-called commodity paradigm thesis, which was made by Grantham, the owner of this large fund with over $100 billion of funds, GMO, its name. And he said in 2011 that we might be facing a new global setting, commodity paradigm, a new great paradigm shift. In this graph, you see that the relative value of commodities has declined all the way during the 20th century. But here he shows that before, at around 2005, there started to be a rapid rise in the value, and his theory was that, and suggestion was that investors, large-scale investors in the Wall Street who follow him, Grantham, that they would start to diversify their portfolios to buy the stocks of corporations which operate in the natural resource extraction sector. And there was a lot of discussion about this, and later on, around 2015, Grantham said that maybe he was a little bit mistaken, because then the prices of commodities had started to drop around 2014. So that if it's just a new boom-bust cycle, or if it's a new paradigm, it's still under discussion, but I would say that it is to a large extent a new paradigm. If you take out the role of oil, because this graph mostly follows oil. If you take oil out, practically all other commodities are in very high valuation right now. They are like 3-4 times higher price than they were before 2005. Next slide, please. So here you see, for example, the price of iron ore. Look at what happened in apart from 2005, and that's the lowest point. What you see in 2014, the decline in iron ore price, it has not continued like that. That was the lowest point, and after that it has risen again. So it was just a relative worsening of the prices, or cheapening of the prices, between 2014 and 2018, and now they have risen again. And some commodities like gold, timber, beef are at their record highs currently during this corona pandemic. So you see that there's a very, very big increase in the price of iron ore, from about $10 per month to like almost $200. So in this period, you see like a rapid peak in iron ore prices, and then you see a lot of rampant expansion all around the world, especially in Brazil and India, which are like among the top 4 exporters of iron ore, especially to China. So in India, you see half of the iron ore extracted being, at least half being illegal, like people just going with trucks, all kind of entities and all kind of people, and just taking iron ore from wherever and trying to export it illegally, and so on. And then you, of course, have more conflicts. So what I'm interested in is to study that peak period and what happens there during that peak period. Next slide. So, so you see that the extraordinarily high boom prices created many problems. Normally, what you see in these boom cycles of commodities is that the problems get exacerbated. For example, in Finland, they started the Talvivaara mine because there was a very high peak in the price of the metals that mine would be using in mid-2000s. In 2005, the price of nickel was in sky high, and then they started to build that mine, and then it plummeted. So when you have this current capitalist world ecology, world system, where you have these boom-bust cycles because of the financialization of the system and the fast trading, it creates actually tangible physical impacts in the real world, which have very negative impacts on the ground for socio-environmentally. Next slide, please. So what I'm saying is that actually it's not only a story of corporations and what markets do, but also resistance can have an impact. And this idea came to me when I started to do the field research. This is from 2011, when I visited the world's largest mine. This is the iron ore mine of Vale Corporation in Carajás in Eastern Amazon in Brazil. It's expanding in the Amazon. Next, please. And here's a photo from downhill. The locals protested heavily this expansion of this mine and its operation. It has like a very long railroad to the shore to export the iron ore to Japan, especially. Yes, next. And here are some other photos from the resistance. So you can see here the red flags of the Brazilian landless movement. They have been active also in these mining conflicts. They were also active in the pulp and the tree plantation conflicts I studied, particularly in eastern and southern Brazil, but also in this region of eastern Amazon. And in these resistance movements, you have not only the Brazilian landless movement, but also other kind of movements joining together, like indigenous people and so on. And their tactic in this has been, for example, to stop the operations of the train, and they calculate that there will be losses of tens of millions of dollars per each day that the train is stopped. Yes, next please. So the resistance there, those tactics are actually involving the actual barring of the expansion of the tangible export of the resource, to not allow the mine to be constructed, to bar its operations, is for the resistance winning tactic. They're saying that as long as it's not there, we are winning it. So kind of like keeping it in the ground. So there are that kind of movements that I'm studying in the book. There are also other kind of movements. There are even local cases like these ones in Brazil that I lay out here, where in some cases there is not so much resistance to mining as such. For example, in the case 7 in Corumbá, at the border of Bolivia, the local indigenous people made a deal with the local corporations, and the operations mostly continued, so they didn't seek for a closure of the mines. So those are the kind of cases I compare for Brazil in here in this map which I produced. And when I started this research, there were no existing maps for Brazil and India on these kind of issues. Yeah, next please. So the first step was to kind of track the commodity chain. And one thing here was like how far to focus within the commodity chain. So for example, I followed the thick iron production, or it's kind of like a produce between iron ore and steel along the railroad tracks. And this is from Western Maranhão on the way to the sea in the Eastern Amazon, to understand the iron steel metal industry complex. But then the research became maybe a little bit too big, so I focused more on the extraction point and less on the steel part of it. And there's still a need to write a book on steel. There's very little research on steel, considering that it's the world's second most important commodity after oil for industrial societies, and in terms of bulkiness. Next one, please. So I followed key activists. This is from 2010 in Goa to the extraction sites. Next one, please. So here in Goa, you see that, for example, this is how the mine started to look like. The activists were detecting those expansions from satellite. This is illegal. So the companies are trying to put that blue canvas there to stop the activists from seeing what's happening from the satellite, and providing the material for then the courts and the state authorities to start to intervene in this illegal extraction, which is not letting the state to get the royalties. Next, please. And here are the cases in India I studied, and those areas, those round areas, roughly correspond with the case study areas. So what I mean by a case varies by size. So I tried to have as large a case area as possible, but if I found that there are, for example, crucial differences in the dynamics of those investment politics, then I separated those as different cases. So you see a big lump of cases, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in Odisha, Jharkhand area there in the eastern India, and those have different dynamics. For example, in Chowda in number 3, that was a place where the mining had already mostly ravaged the local areas. There had been tens of thousands of Adivasi indigenous people who had been forced to move out of there. Nobody knew where they had gone. And the remaining Adivasis were mostly poorly organized, and their leaders were kind of wanting a compensation from the mining companies and not really promoting contentious agency or kind of like habitus of resisting actively, unlike in Keonchar, a little bit south, where there was a very active promotion of resistance and complete barring of expansion by a very impressive process. So in Chowda, for example, when then the orders came by the authorities in the end to stop those mines, to discontinue the operations, the locals actually organized protests to demand for the reopening, to have at least the little jobs they had in the mines. Whereas in other places like Keonchar, they were very happy that there was no expansion anymore. So next, please. So these are some photos from Chhattisgarh, from the where the southern part of the state is mired in a deep resource conflict with the Maoist Naxalite guerrillas, who are mostly Naxalites. So it's a completely different context. The next one. So here is the extract from news story, and those red areas on the map show like kind of like the impact of those armed resource conflicts in India. And those are mostly actually about iron ore and mining, because the last remaining forest spots in those areas of mining and steel plants are actually the places where you have the iron ore, and those are the places where the indigenous people live. So they would have to deplete those areas, and for example, in this case of Rogat, which you see on the map, they are trying to open up that new source of iron ore to give iron ore for that cial steel plant, which employs tens of thousands of people and produces India's railroad tracks, for example, the bars for the railroad tracks. And this Dalirachara, the existing mine, is running out, and they need a new supply, or then they will have to get the resource from somewhere else. And often you have the idea that you could get resources from anywhere. That's not true. It's so costly to get resources for many of the existing infrastructures like big steel plants from elsewhere that it's not really an option for these inland steel mills. So they are like bitter struggles, because then that Raugat close to this state capital Raipur, for example, it's the last remaining forest hillock there. Next one, please. So these are kind of like struggles for survival. In India, the people don't have the place where to go. If they are dispossessed, if they are driven out of the places, they don't have another place to go. Unlike in Brazil, where there's still a kind of like resource or commodity frontier in the Amazon, where the people still go to dig for illegally for gold and so on. So it's a bit different dynamics between Brazil and India. Next one. So that photo, this and that photo was from an area of bauxite mining in northern Chhattisgarh, in a village I visited. Next one. And this is a visit to in the Keonchhar area to a beautiful waterfall called Kandadhar, and that waterfall would have been also a place for a big iron ore mine if the Korean company POSCO would have been able to build a steel plant at the coast of Odisha state. But they didn't manage in that because there was such a strong resistance both here at the location of extraction and especially at the proposed steel mill site. Next one. And this is from also another photo from India, from Rourkela. Next one. And here you can see that there are like people collecting the scraps of like residual minerals from here. So it's all kind of like people carrying them on top of their heads, and normally they are women. So there's all kind of like aspects to study in this whole commodity chain related to socio-environmental injustices and all kind of issues. Next one. So what captivated me was that, unlike elsewhere in the world, mostly in India, about half of the mines were closed between 2010 and 2013. And for example, in Goa, which was India's by far largest iron ore exporter, all the iron ore mines were discontinued. And in Bellary, in the neighboring state of Karnataka, all the mines were also discontinued. So I was interested in how was this possible. Next one. So there's also behind this study a kind of comparison with the industrial forestry, global tree plantation expansion. And the broad lines in the global tree plantation expansion is that in the 1980s, there was a very strong resistance in India against that expansion, with key people like Saxena, Vandana Shiva, and so on, ESG and other NGOs resisting that expansion, and they managed to do that. So in India, you don't see the kind of large-scale pulpwood, hundreds of thousands of hectares of eucalyptus plantations as you see in other places like in Brazil or Uruguay or Chile. So the resistance was the key actor there, and they managed to embed the state. So they managed to create, have a key role in the state and the government in creating policies that forbid and make it hard for that kind of expansion. So these photos of the eucalyptus plantations are from Brazil, and you don't have that kind of visions in other parts of the world. In Thailand, there was also very strong resistance against the kind of style of corporate expansion and now you have smallholder and medium-sized tree plantations there, while the large-scale pulp investments and tree plantations, that capital escaped from Thailand to Australia. And Australia is also the place where the iron ore extraction went after this discontinuations in Brazil and especially in India in 2013. So Australia leads now the extraction of iron ore and its export to China. Next. So resistance can bust resource extraction booms. And if you see what market analysts are saying, they talk about risks. They talk about resource nationalisms and problems in production, but normally behind those vocabularies, there are actually resistance and conflicts, which make it actually harder to extract. So for example, in India, the armed resistance, they have been sabotaging the operations, blowing up tube lines. In the peaceful resistance has been laying their bodies in front of the trucks. Women have been carrying their children on front of the truck, saying that you can drive over them and over us because we have no future if you destroy our lands. So there have been these kind of very strongly symbolic acts of kind of like courage there, and you can see that there's a huge difference in terms of what these local acts have done in globally, because India is now very much behind the other global exporters, and these are tendencies that are hard to reverse. So as the resistance managed to also discontinue and slow down many projects also in Brazil during the peak period, then what happened in Brazil in 2015 and after that were a series of important and destructive destructions of iron ore dams, which created kind of like tsunamis of mud, of silt. And that changed the situation. So now it's not so possible anymore to expand the production in the same way in Brazil. So in some cases, or mostly it's difficult or impossible for the resistance to know what kind of events will happen. So normally it's this kind of politics of time, as Stuart talks, is important in the resisting this mining capitalism. Next, please. So normally a lot of the focus in these kind of studies on how to create a more sustainable world and so on is on the so-called downstream strategies, which means like, of which Bridge talks about, and which means like looking at boycotting campaigns, what the individual consumers can do and so on. But I am arguing that it's actually very important to look at the points of extraction, and we need more studies of those, and those are the key points for global governance and so on. If you don't have the extraction, then you don't have the whole chain of causation behind it. Minerals will get more expensive. The world is a bound place. It's not that they could go every time to every place, but the more resistance you have all around, the less possibilities there will be. Yeah, next one, please. So here is a kind of framework which I propose and explore in the book, in Iron Wheel. And this tries to bring together many of the elements that are important to consider when studying investment politics around resource extraction, either the expansion or the resistance or both. So it parts from the idea that you have to look at both at the corporate side, what the corporations are doing, and then what or other actors which are having extractivist agency, and then what the resistance is doing, and what is their difference. So you can have peaceful resistance, armed revolutionary agency, or armed secession, as I talked. And then an important item of this is that you have meetings between these different agencies, different actions, and they take place in different political games. So contentious politics refers to, for example, the protests or the use of paramilitaries and so on, like different actions, which are mostly mediated by the state, still contentious politics. which defines the key parameters of those political games, the rules, who can be actors and so on, what is considered contentious, what is not considered contentious, what is considered routine actions. And routine politics, routine acts of resistance could go, for example, into the electoral politics or then institutional politics or judicial politics. So this routine politics, which would not be considered so contentious, would be, for example, that the resistance votes for particular politicians that say that we won't expand mining or we will be against mining. And then the companies try to fund the electoral campaigns of candidates who would be in favor of mining. And those different actions meet in the sphere of electoral politics, where the entities try to both change the rules of those electoral politics and then they try to impact through the existing rules and change them. And what I mean by the resistance embedding the state is that the resistance tries to change the rules of, for example, that electoral politics. So in India, you have cases where the resistance has, for example, said that no politician who is in favor of mining can come to our municipalities to do campaigning. You have to sign a memorandum of understanding with us beforehand that you will be against mining. And they managed to do that, for example, in Keonjhar. And only those politicians who signed that kind of memorandum of understanding were allowed to do campaigning. And then when they were elected and they still tried to help companies to establish mines there, then they came with the paper in hand and said that, with protesting, and said that, okay, you made this deal, you cannot do this. And then they were able to actually change the rules, and they were able to ensure that those members of parliament were following their advice of the resistance. So you kind of change the rules by establishing, for example, new rules in the electoral politics. So I'm interested through this framework to study not only like what's happening in terms of the existing structures, but how those are changed by the actions of resistance. It's a dynamic view to resistance. It's taking another step away from the political opportunity structure theory, which assumes that there would be openings from above mostly, and you would then study those openings. But I saw that the resistance really does not know how the situation will be. They just try all kind of means, and later on then the theorists come and say that, oh, there was an opening, there was a possibility. But beforehand, it's very difficult to know that if there will be such an opening and call. And then through all these different actions in different political games, you will have an impact on the economic policy and so on. And by private politics, I mean politics that is outside of the state. It's not mediated by the state, but the resistance meets directly with the corporations there. For example, in the stakeholder dialogues or other kind of like deal, they are trying to make some deals so that you would preempt the possible resistance and conflicts and so on. And this has been a rising topic. And I found that if the resistance partakes in those, they have not been successful in stopping or discontinuing the mining operations. They might have got some compensation, but they have not been actually resisting the expansion of extractivism. Maybe changing a little bit of its style, but it's a path that does not work for resisting extractivism globally. Yeah, next one, please.
I was going to say, Markus, we have about 10 minutes left in the session. I just wanted to let you know that. So if we want to have some time for questions, we're getting close.
Okay, so let's go through the end of the slides just very quickly. Yeah, next one, please. So here is a table where I compare all the cases in Brazil and India. I won't go in detail to that, but this is just to show the qualitative comparative analysis. Next one, please. And here are the strategies I compared. I would like to maybe highlight some of these, but we don't have the time to go in detail. You can read the book and so on. Next one, please. So Jason Moore talks about the end of cheap natures, and yeah, it seems to be the case that we are coming close to that. Next one, because of all the resistance has a role. Yeah, so there were impressive outcomes of resistance. Next one. And also developmental impacts, like, because then if you have those mines, it's very difficult to return or impossible to return to agriculture, for example, because then the soil is lost. Next one. Okay, thank you. So here is some time for discussion, I hope.
All right, thank you very, very much. That was very interesting, and I'm sure that everybody's whistle is wet to go check out Iron Will as soon as it comes out next month. I see that Jana Holtz has a question. If you'd like to ask that verbally, feel welcome.
No, sorry, it was just kind of a digital applause to the interesting talk I wanted to give with the hand raise.
Wonderful, digital applause, that's fantastic. Well, as applause for Markus, does anybody have a question for him? Well, I have a question. How did you get interested in this particular case location? Where did this come from for you?
Well, actually, I met in Finland an Indian activist in 2009, 2010. So I got interested in that case of India then. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. And Maria, I see Maria has a question.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Markus. I have a question for you, or actually maybe two. You say that you think that this is a new paradigm. You said with the prices of the prices going up. And I wonder, thinking of the internet boom of the 2000 and then the housing boom of so the crash in 2008. Do you think that it's maybe that kind of stock market evaluation that is about to burst? That's the first part of it. And the second question that I have to you is, how does the global extractivism, particularly mining, I mean, we have worked on forestry, so particularly mining, how do you see it interlinked with the Green New Deal and the climate change debate? That's my question. And both of them, of course, have to do with your assertion that this is a new paradigm. So is then the climate change and Green New Deal the thing that is making it also a new paradigm?
Well, at that time when I was studying it, those things were not so much present. It was mostly, there was an understanding of the broader significance, but it was mostly resisting because, for example, a mountain was holy, or it was a god, or that kind of thing. It was more related to actually continuing the way of life and so on. And I don't think it's just a bust and boom. When I'm looking at the different prices of commodities, oil, something different is happening with the oil. That's a different dynamics. But for the rest, most of the bulk of the rest, I think it's really like the end of cheap natures, as Jason Moore says. Or actually, in the case of iron ore, you could say that the margins are. It's important to look at not only at the prices of commodities, but also the production costs. So what's happening with the profit margins? Yeah, that's just more research needed on that. I don't think it's over, that debate of the new commodity paradigm. We have to still wait.
But if I refine a little bit, I mean, not the resistance going into mining, but actually the Green New Deal in order to transit from the fossil fuel industry, and the prices you say also are not that clear there, to transit from there into the electric paradigm that is coming strongly. So there, mining becomes much more important in the global economy.
Yeah, that will create.
But as actually part of the whole network that is pushing for this.
Yeah, looking at the realities on the ground, I would see much more problems for the kind of envisioning of electric cars and so on, which require metals than actually the people are understanding there to be, because lithium, for example, demands so much land and so on, has so big impacts. So yeah, I think this kind of research can enlighten that it's not politically feasible, because will have much more resistance. And then the activists, they travel, they go to other places to tell about the impacts and so on. So you might be able to start some of those new projects, but the rest will be having much more trouble. So in the chat, there was a question about the transnational level.
Yes, there was a question, what is the role of the transnational level and transnational spaces for resistance? And unfortunately, due to time, this will probably be the last question we're going to be able to take live together. But if I send you the other lovely question that we have, Markus, would you be able to answer it later and we can send it out to everyone?
Yeah, I can answer both, but just quickly. So about the research methodology. So
okay.
Actually a new book coming out from Routledge about my methodology for this research and other research. I call it multi-sided political ethnography. So I spent about half a year in India and more time in Brazil, and doing field research at the actual places, staying with the communities, following them, their activities, and so on. So that was the method. And then studying that data through qualitative comparative analysis and incorporated comparison. So the transnational level, it's impressive that most of this stuff is still national and local. Or you have the transnational stuff in there, and some resistance is from the start very transnational. And for example, in Brazil, that resistance to Vale and Carajás. And in Goa, the transnational impact was important because there was a transnational community linked to Goa, helping local resistance. But I would say that it's mostly still local and regional resistance. And most of those cases that I study, for example, most people don't know anything about. I mean, the world is full of resistance. That's what I learned, which does not figure in news or headlines.